last century we had 2 massive world wars, 3 if you count the Cold War. I think it's unlikely that we will never have another world war again.
Or if we have another one, it'll be the last.
Yeah, it just could be radioactive rubble.
It's been 5 years since Russia sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. Before that, they did so in 2008 when tensions were particularly high with the U.S. The Russian bomber crews arrived outside Caracas Monday after flying more than 6,000 miles. U.S. intelligence officials monitored the flight of the 2 supersonic Blackjack bombers as they took off from an airbase in Russia and flew over the North Pole and across the Atlantic to Venezuela. These are the same type of bombers which have launched cruise missiles into Syria. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo responded, quote, "The Russian and Venezuelan people should see this for what it is, 2 corrupt governments squandering public funds and squelching liberty and freedom while their people suffer." The Venezuelan president was in Moscow last week. Today, the Kremlin rejected Secretary Pompeo's criticism, calling it undiplomatic, adding a swipe at the Pentagon, saying such criticism of Russian military movements is odd coming from a country, quote, half of whose military budget would be enough to feed the whole of Africa.
Over in Russia, Russian President Vladimir Putin is threatening to target America with nuclear weapons. He made the remarks in his annual speech to both houses of the Russian parliament today.
Putin says that he would not make the first move, but that he'd have no choice if the U.S. puts its own nuclear missiles in Europe. Tensions have been high after the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Cold War-era nuclear treaty before that announcement.
The Trump administration said today it's pulling out of a nuclear arms control treaty that dates back to the Cold War.
The treaty was signed in 1987 by President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. It bans the U.S. and Soviet Union from possessing, producing, and test-flying ground-launched missiles with a range of around 300 to 3,400 miles.
When the Russians put it on display, it looks much like any other missile. But this is the weapon which threatens to unravel decades of nuclear arms control. It is a low-flying cruise missile, which U.S. intelligence says violates the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF for short. Today, the Trump administration announced that if Russia won't abide by the treaty, neither will the U.S.
We can't be put at the disadvantage of going by a treaty, limiting what we do when somebody else doesn't go by that treaty.
Russia, under Vladimir Putin, in what the U.S. believes is an attempt to intimidate the NATO allies, has secretly fielded about 100 of these new missiles, despite what Secretary of State Pompeo said were repeated protests going back to the Obama administration.
We have raised Russia's noncompliance with Russian officials, including at the highest levels of government, more than 30 times. Yet Russia continues to deny that its missile system is noncompliant and violates the treaty.
The U.S. must now decide how to respond, which it could do by taking existing sea-launched cruise missiles and basing them on land.
Russia is firing back at President Trump's new threat to pull out of a landmark nuclear weapons treaty. One Russian official warns breaking the pact would be a very dangerous step.
The U.S. has declared Russia in violation of the treaty by developing prohibited weapons. Russia denies that charge and has accused the U.S. of breaching the agreement.
U.S. defense officials say this is the real deal. Russia test firing its new high-speed hypersonic missile, a missile that the U.S. military currently cannot defend against. Russian President Vladimir Putin pulling no punches on his intent.
The new avant-garde missile system is invincible against today's and future air and missile defense systems of the potential enemy. This is a big success and a great achievement.
If the weapons work as advertised, there is no current defense against them.
The Russian missile has captured the attention of Patrick Shanahan. Shanahan warns the U.S. needs to be able to detect the fast-flying missile much further away than current radar systems can handle. The U.S. has to detect it thousands, not hundreds of miles away because of its high-speed approach. The Pentagon may spend more than $1 billion trying to develop and field its own capabilities.
We're going to need a different set of sensors in order to see the hypersonic threats. Our adversaries know that. The United States Special Operations Command will be changing strategies in the near future. This is according to a new report. But instead of targeting radical terrorist groups, their focus could change to major nations like China and Russia. RT's Rachel Blevins joins me now with the details. Rachel, what's the reason for the significant change in strategy?
Well, Sarah, the officials who are in favor of this change of mission claim that it's simply time for special forces to rebrand. And they say that the military can't keep solving today's problems with conventional methods. So when looking at the new Pentagon National Defense Strategy, it will adapt to the digital age by taking a larger role in cyber warfare, information, and digital age propaganda. The head of the Pentagon Special Operations argued that the nature of war does not change, but the character of war has changed radically in the last 15 years. And in the aftermath of 9/11, the United States focused entirely on defeating terrorist groups in the Middle East. A single authorization for use of military force that gave the president the power to go after al-Qaeda and associated extremist groups was used to justify military action in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Somalia. And the war on terror has cost nearly $6 trillion. While some would argue that Americans are not any safer in 2019, others have noted that the U.S. military is now operating in 40% of the world's countries as a result.
Запуская ракеты-мишени средней дальности и размещая в Румынии и Польше пусковые установки, пригодные для применения крылатых ракет «Томагавк», США эти требования договора прямо и грубо нарушили. Россия будет вынуждена создать и развернуть виды вооружений, которые могут быть использованы не только в отношении тех территорий, с которых для нас будет исходить соответствующая прямая угроза, но и в отношении тех территорий, где находятся центры принятия решений по применению угрожающих нам ракетных комплексов. Мы не заинтересованы в конфронтации и не хотим ее, тем более с такой глобальной державой, как Соединенные Штаты Америки. Мы видим, что имеем дело с деятельными, очень талантливыми людьми. Однако среди правящего класса США много и таких, кто излишне увлечен идеей своей исключительности и своего превосходства над всем остальным миром. Разумеется, это их право думать так, как они хотят. Но считать-то они умеют? Умеют наверняка. Пусть посчитают дальность и скорость наших перспективных систем оружия. Мы просим только об этом. Пусть сначала посчитают, а уже только после этого принимают решения, которые могут создать дополнительные серьезные угрозы для...
Putin's U.S. nuclear hit list revealed. Russian state TV names Camp David as the top location the Kremlin would target with unstoppable hypersonic nukes which can strike in just 5 minutes. Vladimir Putin said Russia was ready for a new Cuban Missile-style crisis after America tore up a key Cold War-era missile treaty. Russian TV showed American targets the Kremlin would hit in the event of war. The Pentagon and Presidential Retreat at Camp David both made the list. Several defunct sites were also included, such as Fort Ritchie in Maryland, which closed in 1998, and McClellan Air Force Base, California, which shut in 2001. Russian state TV has identified American military bases which it says Moscow could strike with hypersonic missiles in the space of 5 minutes if nuclear war broke out between the two countries. The Pentagon and Presidential Retreat near Camp David, in Maryland, topped the list along with Jim Creek, a naval communications base in Washington state. But the Vestina Daily television station also identified 2 targets, a training center at Fort Ritchie, Maryland, and McClellan Air Force Base, California, which are both defunct, having been abandoned in 1998 and 2001 respectively. It comes after Vladimir Putin warned Russia is ready for a new Cuban Missile crisis if the U.S. wants one, after President Trump tore up a key Cold War arms treaty. The report, which was unusual even by the typically aggressive style of Russian TV, was broadcast on Sunday evening. Russia fears the United States might deploy intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe which were previously banned under the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Putin has said Russia would be forced to respond by placing hypersonic nuclear missiles on submarines near U.S. waters. The United States says it has no immediate plans to deploy such missiles in Europe and has dismissed Putin's warnings as disingenuous propaganda. It does not currently have ground-based intermediate-range nuclear missiles that it could place in Europe. However, its decision to quit the 1987 treaty over an alleged Russian violation, something Moscow denies, has freed it to start developing such missiles. Putin has said Russia does not want a new arms race, but has also dialed up his military rhetoric. Some analysts have seen his approach as a tactic to try to re-engage the United States in talks about the strategic balance between the two powers, something Moscow has long pushed for, with mixed results. In the Sunday evening broadcast, Dmitry Kiselyov, presenter of Russia's main weekly TV news show Vesti Nedely, showed a map of the United States and identified several targets he said Moscow would want to hit in the event of a nuclear war. Kiselyov, who was close to the Kremlin, said that Zircon hypersonic missile that Russia is developing could hit the targets in less than 5 minutes if launched from Russian submarines. Hypersonic flight is generally taken to mean traveling through the atmosphere at more than 5 times the speed of sound. For now, we're not threatening anyone, but if such a deployment takes place, our response will be instant, he said. Kiselyov is one of the main conduits of state television's strongly anti-American tone, once saying Moscow could turn the United States into radioactive ash. Asked to comment on Kiselyov's report, the Kremlin said on Monday it did not interfere in state TV's editorial policy.
Well, tonight, Russian state TV has identified McClellan as a target if there is ever a nuclear strike. An anti-American news program showed this map right here reporting hypersonic missiles Russia is developing could be fired from submarines hitting McClellan, Fort Ritchie in Maryland, and Jim Creek in Washington within 5 minutes. Sacramento County's Office of Emergency Services is not commenting on this other than saying it wouldn't know why Russia would target McClellan, which was deactivated in 2001.
President Trump has said the use of U.S. military force in Venezuela isn't.
Candidate for president, I loudly pledged a new approach.
Donald Trump, con Venezuela, no te metas. Hand off Venezuela. Donald Trump, hands off Venezuela.
As Vice President Mike Pence arrives in Colombia, he is set to meet with the man the U.S. recognizes as the president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, following a weekend of violent clashes over humanitarian aid shipments. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo keeping his options open when it comes to Venezuela.
We've said every option's on the table. We're going to do the things that need to be done to make sure that the Venezuelan people's voice, that democracy reigns, and that there's a brighter future for the people of Venezuela.
All right. Former senior Venezuela envoy to the U.S., Isaias Medina, joins us now. Isaias, welcome and thank you for coming on America's Newsroom this morning. Important to hear your voice as we saw that weekend of unrest over the weekend. First, your thoughts this morning, sir.
Thank you so much, and good morning, Sandra. Thank you for having me, and thanks to President Trump, Vice President Pence, to Secretary Bolton, to all the U.S. team that has been working to try to bring, the help that Venezuelan people need from the U.S. and from our allies around the world. I have to tell you, the world has witnessed the atrocity crimes of not only Maduro's proxy armed militias, but also by Cuban-led military that have been committing these ongoing violations of human rights and crimes against humanity. And it is time that right now in Colombia, with the special presence of Vice President Pence, with the presence of our interim constitutional president, Juan Guaido, and with President Duque and all the rest of the Lima Group representatives, that there comes out a decisive, uncompromising ultimatum with a very short deadline. This is very important.
Traffic jams for as far as the eye can see. Venezuelan security forces have set up roadblocks. in an effort to show their allegiance to Nicolas Maduro's government and to slow down Venezuelans headed to the nation's borders, after the opposition called on them to create a humanitarian convoy this coming Saturday.
We're at a roadblock on the way to San Antonio, near the border with Colombia. Soldiers want to stop people here so they don't join the Great March. Maduro's days are numbered. He's disgraceful.
Look, this is just a taste of what happens every day. The violence, nothing is achieved. We're victims of this on a daily basis.
With tensions running high, scuffles with National Guards broke out at a roadblock. Opposition leader Juan Guaido also left Caracas in a convoy, with the goal of making the 800-kilometer trip to the Colombian border, where U.S. aid is being stockpiled. Meanwhile, Nicolas Maduro has closed the Brazilian border and is thinking of doing the same with the Colombian one. He's blocked the aid, saying he doesn't lead a nation of beggars and that it's a precursor to a U.S. military intervention.
Russia's Security Council has warned that the U.S. is getting ready to intervene in Venezuela and topple embattled President Nicolas Maduro. Up to now, Washington has only thrown its support behind self-declared President Juan Guaido, slapping sanctions on officials in Maduro's government as well. It's also urged other Western nations to back the removal of the democratically elected president from power. Well, the secretary of the Russian Security Council now say.
As the political crisis in Venezuela deepens, the State Department is ordering all non-essential U.S. personnel out of the country. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, fighting to stay in power, severed ties with the United States. He's upset President Trump endorsed an opposition leader as interim president. Maduro claims the U.S. wants to install its own unconstitutional government in Venezuela. Manuel Bajorquez is in Cucuta, Colombia, along the border with Venezuela. Manuel, good morning.
Good morning. Venezuela is in the midst of a humanitarian and economic crisis. Since 2015, more than 2 million people have fled the country, many of them coming through ports of entry like this one. You can typically tell who they are by the amount of luggage that they have. Now, opposition leader Juan Guaido wants to change that, but first, he wants President Nicolas Maduro out.
The regime of former President Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate.
Are you considering a military option for Venezuela?
We're not considering anything, but all options are on the table.
A highly unusual weekend session, and at the outset, Russia made very clear its opposition to the proceeding, arguing that any UN involvement in Venezuela constituted a violation of that country's sovereignty.
We don't see any external threats coming from what is taking place in Venezuela. Venezuela does not represent a threat to peace and security. If anything does represent a threat to peace, it is the shameless and aggressive actions of the United States and their allies aimed at the ouster of the legitimately elected president of Venezuela.
Russia demanded a procedural vote to continue. The requisite 9 members voted to do so, but the 4 votes against a signal that yet again the Security Council would not be speaking with a unified voice.
Now it's time for every other nation to pick a side. No more delays, no more games. Either you stand with the forces of freedom, or you're in league with Maduro and his mayhem.
The United States is withdrawing forces from Syria. Well, they are going to try to start a new war now in Latin America, Venezuela. We're not going to give them that satisfaction. Peace, stability, and understanding will prevail in Venezuela, in spite of all the efforts of the countries present here who are trying to trigger a war.
As you know, on January the 23rd, President Trump officially recognized the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the interim president of Venezuela. Venezuela's National Assembly invoked Article 233 of the country's constitution to declare Nicolas Maduro illegitimate. This action was a statement that the people of Venezuela have had enough of oppression, corruption, and economic hardship. Since then, 21 other governments in the region and across the world had joined the United States in recognizing Guaido as Venezuela's interim president. We're going to announce sanctions against Petroleas de Venezuela, Sociedad Anima, or PDVSA, as it's known by its Spanish acronym, the state-owned oil monopoly. We have continued to expose the corruption of Maduro and his cronies, and today's action ensures they can no longer loot the assets of the Venezuelan people.
President Trump congratulating Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido in a phone call
reinforcing that the United States supports him and the country's power struggle. That's the word from the White House this afternoon. You'll remember Guaido is leading the charge to topple the dictator there, Nicolas Maduro, who's been in power since what's being called a disputed election since 2013. Under Maduro, the once rich country has sunk into a deep humanitarian and economic crisis that's forced millions of people to leave the country and millions more to live in starvation in some cases. Guaido declared himself interim president last week and swore himself into office. He says Venezuela's constitution does indeed allow that because he claims Maduro's recent re-election was nothing short of a sham. Thousands of anti-Maduro demonstrators supported Guaido, as did the United States and many of our allies. Venezuelans taking to the streets again today, Guaido encouraging people to leave their homes and jobs for 2 hours of demonstrations to demand that Maduro resigned. The disputed president now says that he's willing to talk with the opposition, but he's refusing to step down.
Venezuela's disputed president Nicolas Maduro now saying he is willing to negotiate with the opposition to end the growing crisis there, but he's ruling out new elections. Florida Senator Rick Scott is on the Homeland Security Committee. Senator, thank you for coming back on the program this morning. So how should the U.S. respond to the growing crisis there?
We have got to do everything possible to put pressure on Maduro to step aside. I've been speaking to the president about this. I talked to the interim president, Juan Guaido, this week, met with Venezuelan leaders down in Miami this week. We've got to do everything we can, just keep the pressure on. Now's the time to get rid of Maduro. I mean, what he has done to just everybody in that country is despicable. You know, these Democrats talk about socialism. That's exactly what Maduro's done, and it's been horrible for parents wanting to have a child, not worried whether they're going to have food or medicine. It's just horrible what's happened. We've got to do everything we can to put pressure on Maduro. These people, these Democrats have said this is a coup. No, this is fighting for democracy and freedom. It's fighting against socialism. It's fighting to do the best thing for Venezuelans.
To what extent do you want us to do everything we can to get involved?
I think we got to put everything on the table.
Which includes what, Senator?
Well, I think we've got to look at every option, military options, every option possible. I think the more Maduro believes we're committed. I want to thank President Trump for listening to all sides, by going out there and talking to Guaido, meeting with congressional leaders, listening to what I had to say, or Marco Rubio, or Mario Splard. But we all have to go ahead and declare them a state sponsor of terrorism. They are. I mean, let's call it what it is. Maduro's a horrible individual that's been horrible for the people of Venezuela, and I'm disgusted at what he's done to Venezuelans.
Administration taking sides in Venezuela's crisis, backing the country's opposition leader, refusing to pull U.S. diplomats out of that country. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is saying this, quote, the U.S. does not recognize the Maduro regime of the government of Venezuela. Accordingly, the U.S. does not consider former President Nicolas Maduro to have the legal authority to break diplomatic relations with the United States or declare our diplomats persona non grata, end quote. Maduro said get out within 3 days. Apparently that's not going to happen. Steve Harrigan watching the latest on this volatile situation that might shape up like a revolution. Steve.
It certainly could happen. That's what people are worried about on the ground in Venezuela and really across the world. It's not just the U.S. that is lining up to back one of these two men who is calling himself the president of Venezuela. It's really the whole world picking sides. On the one hand, you have Nicolas Maduro, a one-time bus driver and Hugo Chavez acolyte. He was reelected last year in an election widely seen as fraudulent by the U.S. and by dozens of other countries. He still has the backing of the military and the security forces. He says he's not going anywhere. He is inside the presidential palace in Venezuela. He's also backed by Russia and China. On the other side, you have the interim president, Juan Guaido. He's been recognized by the U.S., by Canada, and by much of South America. He had several 100,000 protesters out in support of him on Wednesday. He gave himself the oath of office. So you have two men calling themselves the president of Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro has sharply reacted to the U.S. move. He said the time for gringo interventions is over in South America. He's given U.S. diplomats 72 hours to get out. right after he issued that order, the second man calling himself president said, no, the U.S. diplomats don't have to leave. What really is interesting now is to watch what happens next. Will the protesters come back out on the streets? And what will Maduro do with the man calling himself president, now backed by the U.S.? Those protests were violent yesterday. There were water cannons and rocks, but they weren't crushed by security forces. The big thing that's different, Maduro has not arrested the opposition leader. He's perhaps not willing to take that risk and raise the stakes that high yet.
Right, so that is China. Don't forget Russia as well. In fact, this article from AlJazeera.com today is a good reminder of that crucial strategic partnership. In fact, that's what Vladimir Putin said as well, strategic partner. It's called What Russia Stands to Lose in Venezuela. In it, Vladimir Ruvinsky, who is a foreign policy expert at the university in Columbia, says, if I can find it here, Venezuela is Russia's last asset in Latin America. Clearly, that is not something it will just walk away from.
Хотел бы прежде всего выразить признательность нашим алжирским друзьям. Имеет место очередное грубейшее вмешательство во внутренние дела суверенного государства. Как вы знаете, была не одна попытка отстранить Николаса Мадуро от власти, в том числе путем его физической ликвидации. И лишний раз мы убеждаемся, как Соединенные Штаты, которые параноидально тревожатся о том, что кто-то вмешивается в их выборы, не имея на руках никаких доказательств, сами уже в очередной раз за последние месяцы, это далеко не первый случай, просто в Венесуэле это сделано предельно грубо, пытаются выступать вершителями судеб других народов, а на деле просто вмешиваются в их внутренние дела. Тут никакую комиссию Мюллер даже создавать не надо.
Let's get to Venezuela. It has indeed backed down on its demand that American diplomats leave the country. The Venezuelans say they are open to talks. Meanwhile, Maduro is demanding that the military be loyal to him because an attaché defected. He turned around and said, I want a pledge of loyalty from you guys, and he got it. Joining us now, Wall Street Journal columnist Mary Anastasia O'Grady, who's been on top of this for many, many years, actually. Look, I think to some degree this is a standoff between Russia and America. The Russians have got $10 billion invested in Venezuela and some military assets too. They don't want to lose that. They're going to back Maduro.
Well, I think, you raise a good point, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that because don't forget China also has a lot of...
$65 billion there.
And they're owed a lot of... They're being repaid through the oil that's coming out of the ground, which is... they're bringing less and less oil up. But I think what's going to happen here and what we have to keep our eye on, we're stuck in the fog of war right now. But we should pay attention to the fact that there's a lot of violence developing that's not being reported. This violence is between the National Guard and groups of people in slums in very poor neighborhoods that have traditionally, for all these years, been supporters of Hugo Chavez and later of this regime. These groups are clashing. Why? Because these very poor people can't get food, can't get water, can't get electricity, can't get jobs. I mean, they're literally desperate. And so they are fighting these armed forces. Now, I think the news that we saw over the weekend that Russia is bringing paramilitary, we don't know how many into the country. As we've talked about a lot before, Cuba has a lot of interest in hanging on to this piece of real estate on the South American continent. So they're going to be there in big force. The question to me is, will the fact that 30 million Venezuelans want this guy gone, want new elections, will that be enough to basically, forestall any survival of Maduro? And I want to raise one other thing, which I broke this news in my column this morning, which is that the U.S. has officially said to Guaidó, the interim president, you now control all of the assets at the New York Federal Reserve that belong to Venezuela and any of the assets in U.S. banks that are guaranteed by the U.S. government. The Bank of England on Friday refused to, Maduro tried to draw on $1.2 billion of gold reserves. The Bank of England said no. So the strategy among the civilized countries is basically financial right now. And I think that's good for now because I worry about getting, sucked into a quagmire there.
There's no going back. There's no going back.
I don't think the people of Venezuela will go back because, you know, they don't like Maduro. They haven't liked him for a long time. Chavez had kind of like this halo, but he doesn't have that.
It's just a question of how do you get this guy out? Do you get him out by denying any money at all and diplomatic recognition?
That's one of the things that we really need, but I think we need to be also prepared that it could get very ugly on the ground because I do think Cuba and Russia will use paramilitary and the National Guard and anybody they have left to basically hand-to-hand combat.
What will we do then, you know?
I want to show you a running scorecard, right? And it changes of how the world is actually divvying up right now on the question of Venezuela. It does seem that the pressure applied yesterday by superpowers like Russia especially and China to some extent on the U.S. had an effect on this story. But there's also Mexico, for example, that is also not accepting this call. So let's go to the map. Here it is. We've got the map of the world behind me, and I want to take you through it as best I can. All the countries that you see right there in red, see the countries in red? They're essentially saying yes. Yes to the U.S. call to recognize Juan Guaido. And as you can see, it consists of many of the United States, you know, traditional allies. As you're going to see, you know, the British in Europe and Spain and France and Germany. And then if we go over here to Latin America, you're also going to see, you know, countries like, you know, Brazil and Argentina. Most of the countries in the OAS, the Organization of American States, and then countries in the Lima Accord like Colombia and Costa Rica are on there as well. The countries that we've put here that you can see in green, see? So look at all the green on this map. Everything that you see here on the green in this map are countries that are not following the U.S. lead. That means they're either backing Maduro or they simply don't want to engage. They're saying, no, listen, we're staying out of the affairs of Venezuela. Key in these, of course, Russia, and then China, and then as we go across, you're going to see Iran, and you're going to see Turkey, and you're going to see Syria as well. And then over here in the Americas, Mexico, interestingly enough, is staying out of the fray. Cuba, as you would expect, is going to be backing Maduro. Uruguay is also not backing the United States. So, look, this is not etched in stone, and you know, it's possible the entire list is not complete. But what we think this does, and what we always like doing for you, our viewers, is giving you a visual script, really, of how the world is divvying up on this issue, as it does on many issues. Here now, Dan Cohen with more on how the Trump administration's Venezuela policy is being received worldwide.
The Trump administration's attempted coup d'etat in Venezuela has drawn mixed reactions around the world. Directly after Vice President Mike Pence recognized Juan Guaido as interim president on Wednesday, Washington's allies followed its lead. Canada, France, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Paraguay, and Peru, all recognizing the non-elected president. Something to consider, many of these governments in Latin America are in power as a result of U.S.-backed coups themselves. But late Thursday, Russia made its position clear that it wants the U.S. to butt out of Venezuela's internal affairs. Joining Russia in support of the elected Maduro government are China, Mexico, Iran, Syria, Turkey, Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Uruguay. Meanwhile, the EU has come just short of officially recognizing Guaido while asking for a peaceful resolution. EU President Donald Tusk said Guaido has a democratic mandate from Venezuelan citizens and Maduro doesn't. That's despite Maduro having been elected and sworn in as president earlier this month. If anything, this intervention in Venezuela has clearly shown where the dividing lines are when it comes to following Washington's lead. The question is, will the external support be enough for Venezuela to fend off the coup, or will it succumb?
El mundo, para que con amor y la experiencia que tengan, vayan a defender a Venezuela, al pueblo de Venezuela ante el mundo. Y le digamos a Donald Trump, con Venezuela, no te metas. Hand off Venezuela. Donald Trump, hands off Venezuela. De inmediati. Triunfo. Nuestra venganza será el campeonato para Venezuela. Venezuela este año se ha hecho la vuelta al taxi en bicicleta. Immediately. The immediately.
If you watch state television here in Venezuela, and that's really the only way to get news here on television, you really get the sense that this is a nation on a war footing. You see disputed President Nicolas Maduro meeting with the troops, meeting with generals, sometimes even training with the troops running in the field. He has warned his people that this country could be invaded by the U.S., and he has warned Americans not to get sucked into another Vietnam. He is clearly facing the toughest challenge of his 7 years in power here. He faces a charismatic opposition leader who's already been recognized by the U.S. and by much of South America. Juan Guaido is calling for demonstrations today from noon to 2, a walkout. It's going to be really interesting to see how many people turn out, and further demonstrations this weekend. The government is trying to squeeze him. They've frozen Guaido's bank account. They're not allowing him to leave the country, but there's been a stern warning from U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. He says that any harm that comes to Guaido will be met with serious consequences. Bill, back to you.
On the ground there, Steve Harrigan, thanks, live in Caracas, Venezuela.
Good afternoon. Missed you guys. Under President Trump's leadership, the United States economy is growing at record levels, putting the president in a strong position to fix long-standing trade concerns with China. On Thursday, the president will meet with the Chinese vice premier, who is here this week for continued talks. President Trump is committed to achieving greater market access for U.S. exports and better treatment for our farmers, ranchers, and businesses. Fair and reciprocal trade with China will boost long-term economic growth, not only in the United States, but globally. As the president said last week, the United States proudly stands with the people of Venezuela, who have courageously spoken out against the corrupt and illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro. Maduro must do what's right and allow for free, fair, and credible elections in accordance with democratic principles. To speak more about U.S. policy towards Venezuela and to take your questions, I'd like to welcome to the podium National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton, Secretary of the Treasury, Steven Mnuchin, and Director of the National Economic Council, Larry Kudlow. And after that, I'll be up to take other questions of the day. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As you know, on January the 23rd, President Trump officially recognized the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the interim president of Venezuela. Venezuela's National Assembly invoked Article 233 of the country's constitution to declare Nicolas Maduro illegitimate. This action was a statement that the people of Venezuela have had enough of oppression, corruption, and economic hardship. Since then, 21 other governments in the region and across the world have joined the United States in recognizing Guaido as Venezuela's interim president. Today, and I'll turn the podium over to Steven Mnuchin for this purpose, we're going to announce sanctions against Petroleas de Venezuela, Sociedad Anima, or PDVSA, as it's known by its Spanish acronym, the state-owned oil monopoly. We have continued to expose the corruption of Maduro and his cronies, and today's action ensures they can no longer loot the assets of the Venezuelan people. We expect, and Secretary Mnuchin will go into this in more detail, that today's measure totals $7 billion in assets blocked today, plus over $11 billion in lost export proceeds over the next year. We also today call on the Venezuelan military and security forces to accept the peaceful, democratic, and constitutional transfer of power. And to a certain extent, this has already begun. We have seen Venezuelan official and military personnel heeding this call. The Venezuelan defense attaché here in Washington recognized President Guaido a few days ago, and just within the past hours, the first consul of Venezuela's consulate in Miami, Scarlett Salazar, has also declared for interim President Guaido. I call on all responsible nations to recognize interim President Guaido immediately. Maduro has made clear he will not recognize Guaido or call for new elections. Now is the time to stand for democracy and prosperity in Venezuela. I reiterate that the United States will hold Venezuelan security forces responsible for the safety of all U.S. diplomatic personnel, the National Assembly, and President Guaido. Any violence against these groups would signify a grave assault on the rule of law and will be met with a significant response. Now let me give the floor to Stephen Mnuchin, who will describe the sanctions that we're imposing.
Thank you. Today, Treasury took action against Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA, to help prevent the further diversion of Venezuela's assets by former President Maduro. The United States is holding accountable those responsible for Venezuela's tragic decline. We will continue to use all of our diplomatic and economic tools to support interim President Guaido, the National Assembly, and the Venezuelan people's efforts to restore their democracy.
Well, first of all, let's remind our audiences that this is the first time since the war with Pakistan in 1971 that India has crossed over into Pakistani territory to conduct airstrikes. Usually skirmishes around the line of control, which is the de facto border with, for Pakistan and India, is not uncommon, but strikes of this nature are extremely rare. As you heard the Foreign Secretary over there, he did say it was a preemptive strike, and he did say that, that these militants from the Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is the group that claimed the attack that took place earlier this month in Kashmir, that they were planning other attacks on Indian territory, and Indians are claiming that 300 odd militants were killed in this attack. Pakistan, on the other hand, is downplaying this attack. They're saying that there was no damage from these airstrikes, there were no casualties. In fact, the Pakistani army spokesman said earlier today on Twitter that the Indian jets had to scramble hastily and leave hastily after dropping their payload because Pakistani jets were gathering. So we're getting conflicting narratives of what really went on over there. This is not uncommon. This has happened before in 2016 after India launched a so-called surgical strike just across the border after one of their army camps was attacked by militants. So these kinds of conflicting narratives are common from India and Pakistan. It shows that both the countries want to come out on top.
Breaking news this hour. Pakistan says it has shot down 2 Indian aircraft which it claims were over Pakistani airspace. The Pakistani military also says its warplanes carried out airstrikes inside India. India says the Pakistani jets were forced to retreat by its own aircraft, but has not confirmed whether any of its planes were shot down. Well, details are still emerging, but a spokesman for the Pakistani Armed Forces, Major General Asif Ghafoor, has tweeted this. He says that in response to Pakistan Air Force strikes, the Indian Air Force crossed the line of control, the LOC, in Kashmir. He goes on to say that Pakistan shot down 2 Indian aircraft inside Pakistani airspace. One of the aircraft fell on Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, that's written here as A, J and K, and the other fell inside IOC, that's how Pakistan refers to Indian-controlled Kashmir. He finishes by saying that 1 Indian pilot was arrested by Pakistani troops on the ground.
Pakistan says it has shot down 2 Indian fighter jets, which it reports were over Pakistani airspace. 2 pilots, it said, were now in custody. Islamabad also claims its warplanes carried out airstrikes inside India. Delhi says the Pakistani jets were forced to retreat by its own aircraft, but it hasn't confirmed, in fact, it's confirmed that one of its aircraft was shot down, but not a second. Well, the latest escalation is understood to have taken place in and around the disputed region of Kashmir, parts of which are both controlled by Pakistan and India. Both countries' troops there are on the highest alert. It comes 24 hours after the first Indian airstrikes inside Pakistan since 1971, which followed a suicide bomb attack by Islamic militants in India and Kashmir, left 40 Indian paramilitaries dead. Well, a short time ago, we had the first official reaction from Delhi, this by a spokesman, Ravish Kumar, explaining that Indian strikes on Tuesday had been based on credible evidence that the alleged militants they targeted were planning further attacks.
Both India and Pakistan have more than 100 nuclear weapons each, far more than enough to create a nuclear winter which will kill us all. They have fought 3 wars since 1947, and India is developing a nuclear submarine fleet so it can fire its missiles from anywhere.
Even a war between India and Pakistan, two of the smallest nuclear powers, with only a few hundred weapons of about the size of the Hiroshima bomb, we might die as unintended consequences. My colleagues calculated the spread of smoke after a war between India and Pakistan. It only takes about 2 weeks for the smoke to cover the entire Earth, and it would rise to altitudes between 20 and 50 miles above the surface. At those altitudes, it never rains. The smoke would stay there for years. This farmer may be in Europe or in the United States, but many thousands of miles from Pakistan and India, is looking at the smoky sky above him and down at the crops that have died in his field from lack of light and cold temperatures. It's estimated that in a war between India and Pakistan, that we would lose 10 to 40% of the yields of corn, wheat, and rice for years afterward because of the bad weather. The entire world only has enough food to feed the population for 60 days unless agriculture produces more food. It's estimated that 1 to 2 billion people would die after a war between India and Pakistan of starvation.
Escalating military tensions between the U.S. and Russia as Pentagon officials game out a response to Russian aggression in Europe. Vladimir Putin is now making some serious moves in the Caribbean.
Putin is on America's doorstep with nuclear-capable bombers that can fly at twice the speed of sound. It's a bold move right out of the Cold War as the Russian president tries to establish a military foothold near American shores. A Russian bomber with an impressive wingspan touches down at America's doorstep. Two of these bombers, nicknamed Blackjacks, are in Venezuela tonight. Vladimir Putin has deployed these warplanes along with 2 support aircraft to conduct exercises over the Caribbean with Venezuelan forces. A worrisome development for Washington, considering the capability of the Russian bombers, which can fly twice the speed of sound.
This bomber was designed to do both high-altitude and low-altitude penetration of airspace with nuclear weapons, to deliver nuclear weapons on target. This aircraft was designed to be an offensive-capable weapon to get into our airspace during the Cold War.
Analysts say Putin is sending an unmistakable signal to the United States tonight.
He's clearly trying to send a message to the United States that he can play in our backyard and that Russia maintains significant military capabilities.
Putin has made it very clear through his actions and through his commentary that he intends to reestablish Russia to the level of influence of the Soviet Union.
Meanwhile, tensions are extremely high tonight between 2 nuclear powers. Not here in the U.S. World leaders are urging Pakistan and India to take some deep breaths after 2 days of the most intense conflict between the two countries in 20 years.
Pakistan says it has shot down 2 Indian aircraft, which it claims were over Pakistani airspace. The Pakistani military also says its warplanes carried out airstrikes inside India.
Tensions are high between India and Pakistan as both countries order airstrikes against each other. Both countries have nuclear weapons. Pakistan says it shot down 2 Indian warplanes and captured one of their pilots.
And after a full-scale nuclear war, temperatures would plunge below ice age conditions. We would be in a nuclear winter. No crops would grow. It's estimated that 90% of the population of the planet would starve to death, and civilization would be destroyed. And no one would be safe. Not those in countries with no nuclear weapons, not those in countries that didn't participate in the war, and not those on the other side of the planet from where the explosions occurred. No one would be safe.
Even small exchanges could be absolutely devastating. You're going to have first the destruction effects, you'll have fallout, you may have some climatic effects that spread.
For his part, Robach has modeled a hypothetical worst-case scenario, which suggests that widely dispersed smoke from a small regional nuclear conflict could cause cooling of several degrees across parts of the world.
It would be enough to have a huge impact on agricultural production. The world would have much less food
So you can imagine these political instabilities developing.
Two issues between Canada and China. Number one, the arrest of the Huawei executive in Canada. Number two, China is holding Canadian citizens. Joining us now, David Mulroney, former Canadian ambassador to China. Mr. Ambassador, are the Canadians held in China hostages?
There's no doubt about that, Stuart. And the Chinese officials, the ambassador to Canada, have said as much, that indeed this is tit for tat because of the arrest in Vancouver of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou.
So the arrest of the Huawei executive, that is all lumped in to the trade deal and Canada-US-China relationship. It's all one big cake, right?
It's all connected. And one of the points of connection, there's been real controversy in Canada recently over whether the Huawei case has been politicized and whether it's a side issue. But at one point, the issue is the same. It's whether China plays by the rules and obeys its own laws and international law. Same issue.
How do Canadians feel about this? Are they a little annoyed, maybe, at America?
Well, we've had a confusing couple of weeks, to put it mildly. Our ambassador to Beijing, a man named John McCallum, who was a former cabinet minister in Canada, which is a bit of a rarity to have to move from the political side to the public service. He gave a couple of speeches in which he said he thought that Ms. Meng had a strong case, very odd for an ambassador to say, and two, that it would be great, as in his words, if she were returned to China. This generated a lot of controversy, and ultimately Prime Minister Trudeau had to fire him. So the number two is running things in Beijing, but it really muddied the waters.
We recognize China is an extremely important and growing economy, a significant player on the world stage. We look forward to continuing to trade with China, but we need the Chinese authorities to understand that when it comes to the rule of law, Canada and an awful lot of other countries will stand firm.
As a rift between Ottawa and Beijing widens, sparked by Canada's arrest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou and the subsequent detainment of two Canadians, there are new worries about how the diplomatic tensions are affecting business ties between the two countries. China is Canada's third largest trading partner, and with billions of investment dollars at stake, the business community is getting worried. Katie Simpson on how they're managing the uncertainty.
When it comes to products this country is known for, this is about as Canadian as it gets. Producers send maple syrup all around the world, and it's becoming more popular in China.
Any exporting company has to really consider being in Asia in general, because this is where the growing, the buying power is.
Citadel is one of Canada's largest syrup exporters. It won't reveal how much it ships to China for competitive reasons, but it hopes to increase sales to Chinese customers by 500% over the next 5 years. The company is closely following the diplomatic dispute between Ottawa and Beijing, and while it hasn't hurt business yet, there is anxiety the hit could come.
If it continues and if it goes bad, obviously, we anticipate that there could be some commercial setbacks.
A senior business source tells CBC News Canadian corporate leaders are in panic mode, worried prospective deals with Beijing are at risk. The government is keeping them updated, but it can't offer any assurances that China is through retaliating.
The bottom line is that businesses hate uncertainty.
The president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is careful to choose his words.
I'm not aware of any business that has said we have decided to pull out of China as a consequence. But there's no question that people are looking more carefully than they would normally and examining whether this is the appropriate time to be taking further steps.
That's the question for Citadel. Managers have plans to travel to Shanghai for a food show in May.
If the situation continues to decay, and we'll see if it's appropriate to go.
There's very little chance this dispute will be resolved by spring, which means Citadel and other Canadian companies have some tough choices ahead. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Ottawa.
Taiwan's president announced her re-election bid this week amid a boost in her popularity following her rejection of a peace deal with China. In contrast, the Taiwanese opposition party leader has promised to sign a peace treaty with Beijing if indeed his party is able to regain the presidency in 2020. Evangelos Sipsas reports.
For China, this island is part of its own territory. But for Taiwan, China is a threat. If you believe the Western media narrative, this free democratic land needs to defend itself from the imperialist ambitions of Xi Jinping's government.
China's threats to forcefully retake the island.
Not just engaging in belligerent rhetoric, it's trying to cut Taiwan off further from the business community, making them redraw their maps that Taiwan is part of China.
It has long refused to rule out the use of force to achieve that goal.
Taiwan has looked to the West ever since it split from mainland China in the wake of the Civil War in 1949. But the vast majority of the UN members have never recognized it as an independent country. And Beijing has always stuck to its one China policy.
Taking responsibility for the nation and future generations, both sides should pool our wisdom, resolve the political rivalry, and bring about sustainable peace across the Taiwan Strait, with a long-term vision for reunification of the motherland.
Now Taiwan's opposition Kuomintang Party is determined to finally resolve the dispute. But it will have to wait until the presidential elections in 2020.